Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Student Impact Report brought to you by the Student Basic Needs Coalition. I'm Taylor Allgood, joining you from Washington, D.C., and I'm joined this season by Owen Tanner Flomberg, co founder and co executive director of SBNC. This is our fourth episode of the series, so if you haven't done so yet, please check out our other episodes on Spotify and YouTube. We have those linked in our Instagram link tree at SBNC underscore USA. Um, but yeah, without further ado, if we want to jump into the topic today, how are you feeling? How are you doing today?
Yeah, no, glad to be here. Another eventful week with higher education news. I know we've got one story we're going to focus on this week coming out of UCLA. But yeah, I'm hanging in here. It's Halloween, so happy
Yeah, got
Halloween and
my
Hallow.
Halloween
Yeah,
shirt.
you've got the T-shirt. Um, and yeah, I can't believe we're already at the end of October here. I think this has been a very eventful semester, chaotic semester in a lot of ways. And yeah, excited to dive into it.
Yeah, let's get into it. So, as you mentioned, our story for today dives into the recently uncovered demands that the Trump administration has issued to UCLA. It was a 27-page draft resolution agreement that, among other things, would have fined the university $1.2 billion dollars and imposed sweeping restrictions on everything from transgender healthcare to international student enrollment. The draft agreement, which was made public after a faculty lawsuit, has sparked national outrage among higher ed leaders who say it represents a direct attack on academic freedom, diversity, and student rights. And so I just want to gauge your thoughts on what this moment means for campuses across the country, starting with the fact that we know that this story isn't happening in isolation. We've seen similar federal actions at institutions like Harvard, Columbia, and the University of Virginia. So, my first question is, how do you interpret this trend of the federal government using funding and leveraging that to influence campus policies and restrict student freedoms?
Yeah, so I think my first, I think preliminary understanding here, and I think is important to tease out, is this is really uncharted waters. We haven't had the federal government try to leverage its power that it does have with federal funding over institutions in the way that the Trump administration currently is. So when I say that this is uncharted waters, it really is uncharted waters in how, especially the Trump administration, is not only withholding funding and putting conditions on public institutions, but also private institutions, such as some of the ones that you mentioned, like Harvard and Yale and some of those other elite institutions that receive federal funding too. And I think there's more of a playbook for this happening at the state level, where like a governor or state legislature in a state may put conditions upon institutions to in order for them to receive funding from the state. But we've seen really over the last several decades, states disinvest or not invest more, especially after the 2008 financial crisis, as a lot of states had to really tighten their belts when it came to their state budgets. State funding for higher education has really kind of come under not necessarily attack, but has taken a back seat within a lot of states. So those federal dollars are even more important because they're often the lifeblood that both public and private institutions rely on for funding for research and graduate assistantships and all the other things that federal funding goes towards on institutions across the country. So really kind of uncharted waters here. It's going to be interesting how this really hasn't gone in front of the judicial system a ton yet. So I'm really interested to see how judges react to some of this, even conservative judges, because I think this is one of these trends that we've seen, especially over the past few months, is the Trump administration, coming to politics, coming to policy from what they purport as a very, conservative mindset, but more traditional conservatism would, I think, have some issues with kind of the big government nature of how the federal government's coming in right now and making these demands on institutions.
One thing I guess I just wasn't as clear about before was how much like private institutions actually do utilize like federal funding as well. Like, I don't know, not to say that this is okay in any case, I don't think that this federal oversight should be the case for public institutions either that rely on federal dollars. But yeah, I guess I just wasn't as aware before, like how much private institutions also utilize federal dollars and how that has actually been used to kind of get at some of these private institutions as well. Because I know a lot of people think, oh, if they're private, they run by their own rules. They're not as affected maybe by some of these things, but we're seeing that that's not exactly the case.
No, and higher education is really complicated, kind of in this realm, as you touch on, Taylor, because you've got these private institutions. They're called private institutions, but they rely a lot on federal funding and even often state funding as well, for different functions of their university. And especially in the context, and I know this is an issue with the UCLA demands, is the hospital systems that a lot of even private institutions, I know UCLA is a public institution, run are often also reliant on federal and state funding, even though they're private to a degree. So, yeah, institutions, private, public, are really in, like I said, uncharted waters here, as I think the federal government, the executive branch, is really trying to test what they can and can't do with these institutions. And I think it's important to take a zoom back here and really think about what's going on. So I'm putting my lawyer hat on to provide this context. But what's going on right now is not in really the court system. This is like negotiating. Like, these institutions are negotiating with the Trump administration and the executive branch. And I think it's important that people realize that, because these institutions can agree or acquiesce to any of these demands that they want. There could be challenges to that different stakeholders may, sue their institution or sue the administration. Putting that aside, these public and private higher education institutions can really agree to these demands, even if the federal government doesn't even have the power to demand it, if that makes sense. So what I'm trying to communicate here is, just because these institutions agree to do something that the Trump administration demands of them doesn't mean that the Trump administration actually had the legal justification and rights to demand it. What I think some of these institutions, and there's been a lot of reporting about this, would rather just go along with some of these demands and negotiate, instead of bringing this into court and jeopardizing that funding even over a period of time. And I think there are some, maybe more on the left, that would say that schools should not, negotiate at all with the Trump administration on some of these demands. But I do think that there are some institutions with legitimate concerns of, hey, if this money goes away, this research is going to go away. Our ability to serve folks through our hospital system may be jeopardized, and people could get hurt or be damaged financially or health-wise or and the long-term impact of pausing research be affected negatively. So I get why, some of these institutions are, attempting to negotiate here. And I think they're trying to avoid court and avoid any pauses in funding, similar to like what we're seeing with SNAP right now, is we're getting to a cliff here on Monday where SNAP payments are not going to go out, and because the funding isn't there and allocated, and the administration's not letting the extra funding that's available to go back into the SNAP program. So think about that in a similar way. Thinking about this institutional funding is, I think these institutions have legitimate concerns of, if we don't negotiate and this goes to court, and there's a period of months or maybe even years where we don't have this funding that we think we have the right to, or the Trump administration doesn't have the right to rescind it, can get really complicated and really drawn out.
I see. Thank you for providing that context because, yeah, I think sometimes I was still a little bit unclear about, it just seems like there's so much like jumble in the news. It's like you don't know what's going on sometimes, or, a lot of people saying, yeah, is this allowed? But it makes sense for people who are pointing out, these universities are stuck between a rock and a hard place. Like they either have to try to negotiate and keep that funding going, even in the short term, or like you said, take it to court, which could be a lengthy process.
Yeah, and I would expect that this is going to be drawn out through the rest of the administration. And we won't know what's going to happen in 2028, obviously, with what kind of new administration we may be looking at. If it's going to be a continuation of kind of these policies and priorities, or if it will be a whole new direction. But I would really expect to really continue to see these kind of stories popping up over the next several years, as I think the Trump administration and the Department of Education try to get different concessions out of these institutions, whether they have the right to demand them or not.
Well, I know our topic for today kind of zooms in on one particular campus, UCLA, in light of the 27-page draft resolution agreement that was recently uncovered, that kind of highlights these demands the Trump administration has issued to UCLA. And and in my kind of research on this, there's one particular article from Inside Higher Ed that highlights some of these demands and goes more into depth. And I don't want to misquote, so I'm going to read exactly one section that I read, and I want to gauge your thoughts of what you make of this statement, and what concerns or thoughts it might raise for you in how we define free inquiry, and acceptable speech on campus. The quote reads, quote, "The Trump administration has demanded, among other things, that UCLA not enroll foreign students likely to engage in anti-Western, anti-American, or anti-Semitic disruptions or harassment." In the same paragraph, the proposed resolution agreement says UCLA would have to, quote, "socialize international students to the norms of a campus dedicated to free inquiry and open debate." What do you make of that statement?
So my first reaction to this, and I know I read this statement earlier today, is just exhaustion, I think, is, and I think, a level of frustration as well, that this is kind of what the administration is so focused on. I think that, there is, a culture war element to higher education. There has been for a really long time. And I think institutions have been kind of caught in the crosshairs of that and I think that they, to a degree, should be. If higher education is this place where there's supposed to be freedom of inquiry, there's supposed to be freedom of speech, this is supposed to be where folks in our country kind of come together and talk about the issues. And while we might not all agree, it's a place to communicate. And I feel like the statements that you just read uh, run counter to that. And I think they run counter to this idea that we want our institutions to be this place of coming together, talking about issues, and coming up with different solutions, even if we don't all agree on the solutions. I think what is additionally concerning about this, and this is again me putting on my lawyer hat, is what does that even mean? Is anti-Western, anti-American, anti-Semitic disruptions or harassment? What does that mean? Because there aren't clear definitions of what any of those terms mean. And who's going to be interpreting that? Is that the administration? Is that courts? Is that the higher education institution itself? There's a lot of questions, and I read over the released proposal that you're referring to related to UCLA, and they don't have the answers to these questions in there, and the answers that they do pose, I think, leave even more questions. So I think that's a real area of concern that I have is great, even if you want to agree to this, what does that mean, and who's enforcing and interpreting what that means? And it's like they're saying, okay, you can still enroll foreign students or non-American students, but they can't be students that are anti-Western, anti-American, anti-Semitic, the list goes on. But like, when are they going to be evaluated for that? When they apply? Are we going to have them do an ideology test? Is that what these schools are going to really do? Is this going to be retroactive? They continue to admit students from other countries and then wait for when there's an issue and then try to enforce suspension. And like, what does that also do to, I know, going back to it, the freedom of expression and debate and inquiry on these campuses, if everyone is concerned, or the population at least on the campus, being international students, are concerned, if I say something, is this going to be construed as anti-Western, anti-American, or anti-Semitic, the list that they list out there. And I think particularly the one that the two that I'm really honed in on is that anti-Western and anti-American. So does that mean that international students can't critique of the past action of the United States, or say that there might have be a better policy solution to some challenge that we have? It just doesn't make any sense. And I think if these institutions do agree to language like this, it will end up in the courts, and it will be ultimately, I think, courts to determine what this means. And I think you're going to see a wide variety in how this is interpreted by different judges, given what's going on the bench right now.
Mhm. Well, I know in addition to the demands related to monitoring international student enrollment, there's also language about, limiting and restricting healthcare for transgender students and individuals, with one line from the article reading that, quote, multiple provisions aim to limit transgender individual rights. The document demands that UCLA's medical school and affiliated hospitals stop performing hormonal interventions, surgeries for anyone under 18, stop allowing transgender women to play on sports teams. And what I found most striking, strip records, awards, and other recognition from transgender women athletes, and send personal apologies to the cisgender women who placed lower than trans athletes. There's a lot going on in that statement alone. So again, I just want to gauge, what are your thoughts on this, and what do you like, putting on your lawyer hat again? Like, is this allowed? Like,
I think that's the part of the question that I was posing earlier is, or part of the this whole situation is, these schools can agree to whatever they want to agree to, but it doesn't mean that the administration has the justification or legal backing to demand the things that they're demanding. And I think this part of it is really interesting, and it's horrifying because I know lots of trans folks, work with and am friends with lots of trans folks, and they're not doing anything wrong. Leave them alone. And I think, even the polling shows is most Americans just want to leave folks that are trans alone. And whatever treatment that trans folks choose to obtain or pursue should be between them and their doctors. And it shouldn't be the Trump administration coming in and banning hospitals from providing that care. And this is not new. We've been seeing this. And this has been, I think, a kind of a refrain of some of these crackdowns or issues with funding and withholding funding in a lot of different contexts is around trans folks and trying to punish institutions within our society from, protecting and serving that population. And I think Americans are getting tired of it. I think this is, I think, an issue that folks from, the left and the right are really tired of talking about. Because I think it's just society is moving past, I think, some of the stigma and discrimination that I think has been, and still is very commonplace for this population. So, I'm frustrated, I think, like many of these demands, and again, not really super workable. And I can see this ending up in court very easily. And I think that, again, we're going to keep seeing more of this. And I think this is not the first time we've seen this, not the last time that we'll see it, because it goes back to that cultural fight, that culture war that I think the administration is really, quite evidently plugged into.
Well, even though this situation in this article, particularly that we're discussing, is specific to UCLA, we know that the implications clearly extend beyond one campus, right? What message do you think this sends to students across the country, particularly international and students from other marginalized groups? Like, what do you think this message sends to students about their safety and belonging and freedom to speak and live on campus?
Yeah, well, I think the first message that it gives or sends to international students, and I know we talked about this the other week, is it says, don't come here. Don't come here and learn. Don't come here and help contribute to our economy. Don't come here and contribute to our society, our culture. And I really think that it is going to have long-term effects, even if this administration does a 180 on this, or even if the next administration does a 180 and starts, trying to welcome international students and the talent that they can bring to our country and our economy. I think for domestic students, it also says to, I think, a lot of populations, you're not welcome in higher education. We don't want you to go to higher education, attend college or university, and succeed and learn and grow civically and become a productive member of our society. And I think, populations like we just talked about, like trans folks, like the folks in the LGBTQ community, folks from different other marginalized or racial or ethnic minority backgrounds are hearing that loud and clear. I hear that a lot with some of the students that we work with. Is it does feel like campus has gotten a lot more hostile towards different identities, but I think, like we talked about, I think the other week, is there's a lot of bright spots still too. And while maybe institutional priorities have changed and aren't supporting some of these populations and making them feel welcome, included, and encouraged to join the campus community as a student, I think there's a lot of great stories of professors and administrators and students and student groups working to fill that gap and working to encourage students to continue to pursue or start to pursue their higher education, no matter where they're from or who they are. And I think that's going to be the hopefully the shining example over the next couple years as this stuff continues, or until institutions really decide to push back on some of these demands. And I'm curious to see, especially after we've got an election on Tuesday, the New York election, and then state elections in New Jersey and Virginia, and a collection of other local elections across the country. And I think depending on how that goes might change some of the strategies that these institutions are employing, and how maybe they're if the election goes more blue, which I think some folks are thinking that it will, it might give some of these institutions a little bit more courage to stand up for all the populations that they serve.
Absolutely. And, you know, stepping back and really zooming out here for students and campus leaders who might be listening, what should those student advocates, campus leaders, organizations, and the like be doing right now to, either safeguard student rights, prevent these types of federal overreaches from shaping higher education's future, or just to gain awareness? Like what should these groups be doing to chip into the fight against this, so to speak?
Yeah, and I think the most important thing that they can do is attempt to be heard. And there's a bunch of different ways that students can do that. They can do that through, demonstrations on campus, or kind of like physical actions. They can also do this as simply as, and I know everybody's heard this a million times, but contacting their respective lawmakers and making their voices heard. And I think what some other reporting that I've read is, like, there's a lot of lawmakers right now, even those that support the Trump administration, that are also a little frustrated about what's going on, whether that be these demands on higher education, whether that be the cuts in SNAP, or potentially to the Obamacare subsidies. And I think the more that these lawmakers, particularly federal lawmakers, so think about your member of the House, U.S. House, or your senator or your senators from your state, contacting them, hearing from students, no matter what your background is, I think is something positive that students can do in the immediate. And I think in a much longer sense, making sure that they're, communicating with their administrations too, because their administrations feel a ton of pressure right now, from different groups, student groups, faculty groups, staff groups, unions, and I think that are pushing back, I think, on a lot of these demands, where on the schools that are dealing with them. And I think the more that students can incorporate their voices within that pushback, and it doesn't even have to be through demonstration, just literally communicating, sending emails to administrators, showing up, to talk to them at their office, is a great way that students can make their concerns heard, because nobody owns a public or private nonprofit institution, which most students attend. They are collections of a bunch of different stakeholders, And students are one of those stakeholders. And I think the more that they communicate maybe their dissatisfaction with some of these things, it'll be very productive, I think, in a lot of ways, as higher level administrators are having conversations about what the implications, of acquiescing to any of these demands will be.
Absolutely. Students, citizens, we all reserve and maintain the right to speak out against this and to really speak up for ourselves and how these policies are impacting us because, you know, we're the everyday citizens that these policies affect. And I feel like at the highest level when these things are getting pushed out into the news, like it just I feel like they separate the topic from the people that it affects. Like it almost feels like
Yeah,
you can, read a headline, but not even really like take home like what that really means in translation for the majority of American people. And so it is those people who speak up and share their story and talk about the real lived implications of these that truly make a difference in communicating that to our lawmakers and getting something changed.
yeah, no, definitely. And um, it's hard to stay on top of the news. But I think because there's a new uh, crazy story or crazy problem that I feel like comes up every single day. But I think I really encourage students and listeners here to, if you got to focus on something, focus on the local impact of all this stuff on your campus and push back against it. Um, and stay focused on that because I think that's really important. Because with everything going on, I think it's really hard to keep that focus and keep that attention if you're not hearing about some of these things every day. Which this only percolates into the national news. I feel like every couple weeks in a meaningful way.
Yeah, and I would just add on one last thought to just, remain curious and remain invested in learning more because like you said, with all this news coming out, I feel like one part of the challenge is just that people feel so overwhelmed with information. Sometimes even myself, like I feel,
I do.
hesitant to like speak on things and provide my opinion about it because I want to make sure that my opinion is and my stance on the matter is well informed, but sometimes with how much information there is out there, that can feel kind of like a daunting task. But, you know, the best that we can always do day to day is just to continue to try to, understand the facts and what's happening as best as possible. As humans, it's hard to be totally objective in certain cases, but we should always just try our best to understand what's happening around us.
Yeah, no, definitely, definitely. And one of these weeks, it might be years from now, we'll have a slow news week, but I'm not holding my breath.
Well, stick around, everyone, because next up, I'll be joined by our SBNC colleague, August Maulfair, to discuss how student government leaders can mobilize around basic needs advocacy on their campuses. August Maulfair is the campus program manager for Student Basic Needs Coalition. In their work with SBNC, August oversees strategies related to student government outreach efforts, the development of various statewide student working groups, and also works with SBNC's Peer Navigator program. In addition to their work with SBNC, August is also the executive director of SNAP Volusia, a local nonprofit where they live that works to increase SNAP access at their local farmers market. August graduated from Stetson University in 2022 with a degree in philosophy and political science. During their time as a student, August was the director of the university's nonpartisan political organization. August also worked with the local League of Women Voters chapter. And lastly, August did legal writing and some research for a law firm based out of Fort Myers, Florida, throughout their time at Stetson. So, welcome, August. It's great to have you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to do this.
Yeah, I think I saw today that you received Stetson University's inaugural, what was it, the 10 of the last 10 Young Alumni
Yeah,
Award?
yeah, they're giving it's like for the past 10 years, it's like one alumni from every year. So I went
Well,
for my year.
congratulations. Hats
Thank you.
off to you for that.
Thank you.
So
Yeah, it's
yeah,
exciting.
I'm happy to ask you just some questions today just about, your involvement, your work, your background. So if it's okay with you, we're going to jump into some things. How's that?
Yeah. Yeah, sounds good. Go for it.
So, first off, you've built a dynamic career around student advocacy and civic engagement, from your time at Stetson University to now your current work with SBNC and Snap Volusia. So, can you first walk us through what first drew you into this line of work?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. It's kind of serendipitous in some ways. When I was a first year student at Stetson, I met the director of the Center for Community Engagement at Stetson, and we were just talking. I think I had said something about he like came to visit one of my classes that I was in, and I just like rose my hand and said something about whatever question he answered. He's like, we should get lunch and talk more. And he ended up becoming like a, life mentor, career mentor to me, and really inculcated these values of civic engagement within me. Um, it taught me that, for all these things I deeply believe, and all these things I think about how the world could be better or how it could be different, there is a lever that I can get my hand on to make this, systemic changes possible that, I think need to happen. And he taught me how to identify those levers and how to, wield people power in order to make changes. And I'm just that type of person where if I see something wrong, like I can't just like look past it. My mind gets stuck on it and I can't stop thinking about it. I've always been that way. I don't know why, but um, and so he was a staff advisor for, his name's Kevin Winchell. Shout out to him. He's a staff advisor for the nonpartisan group that I ended up becoming the director of. Um, and really through there, I was able to see that, like, there's a lot of change that can be made. And I worked a lot with college students, and that's really where I found my, like, uh, enjoyment and fulfillment that comes from working with college students. There's just so much like passion and excitement when you're a college student. Uh, and like, you're seeing the world in this whole new way for the first time. And I love to just capture that energy and direct it, uh, you know, direct it and build capacity so that change can be made. Yeah.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing. So, I know you were pretty involved as a student leader, and you also have a background in political science and philosophy. How did that shape your approach to advocacy in organizing? Did you always kind of know that you wanted a career like this?
No, I actually never would have thought this is what I want to do. I initially was planning on going to law school and then trying to become like in undergrad. I always said I wanted to be a Supreme Court justice. So I never really thought that I'd find my way into like the food insecurity world. Um, but really, what like philosophy especially contributed to my approach was this sort of like, concept first analysis, right? And critical analysis. I specifically studied in philosophy, like critical theory, and so constantly interrogating presumptions about, why things are the way they are. What do they have to be? What is movable, um, right? Because oftentimes people say, this is just the way it has to be, or this is objective, or whatever. But oftentimes, all these things are socially contingent, we'll say. And so that's sort of the approach I take when doing this work, is really like ground up, blank whiteboard, where can we go? And really you can go anywhere from there. I also tend to think very like long-term strategic analysis, I guess, about things. What is our ultimate goal? And then work backwards from there. And so I'm not really one to say, yeah, that sounds great in theory, but really we have to do this now. We can't really be thinking like that now. I will always be thinking about how every action we take moves us towards or away from those long term goals. Um, and I'm a theory first thinker, right? Like, what are the conceptual underpinnings of what it is that we're saying? Do theories support this? What are the, uh, issues or fallacies of those theories? um, and that kind of undergirds everything I do. I'd like to think, at least.
Yeah, I really like how you know, bring up that idea of concept first and really questioning those underlying assumptions. Because you're right, a lot of things that exist today do uh, exist with the assumption of maintaining the status quo, so to speak.
Right.
And so a lot of these movements start around asking those questions of why do things have to be like this? And so, SBNC, Student Basic Needs Coalition, that organization was also founded on identifying a gap and a need and kind of
Mm-hmm.
questioning why are things looking like this in the college landscape? Why are student basic needs not being invested in, and things of that sort. And so my next question for you is kind of what led you to join Student Basic Needs Coalition, and what does your role as campus program manager look like on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. So with that first question, what brought me here? Like nothing makes you realize what you need more than not having it. And so my previous job, it was like very much so one of those institutions that was like very stuck in their ways, you know. I was often getting told to like stay in my place, and I knew that I need an organization that more aligned with this like ability to interrogate what is happening, what are we doing, why are we doing it, and being willing to be uh, agile and like more open to change, right? And I was friends with Alexis Newman before they worked with Student Basic Needs Coalition. Uh, she was my supervisor at one of my other jobs when I worked at Stetson after graduating. And I knew she worked with SBNC, and there was a role opening, and I was trying to get out of that job I had, and so I applied for this, and now here I am. And it's been amazing ever since. That's just something I really uh, appreciate about SBNC, right? It's like we operate according to like the most bleeding edge best practices, and like we're constantly uh, there's like a very tight like iterative like feedback loop in our organization, and so we're constantly like reassessing what we're doing, and willing to make changes as necessary, double down on the things that are working, and so I appreciate that a lot. In terms of like day to day, it's a lot of meetings and emails for sure. But really, like every day, I'm sitting down with other people in our organization and talking about ways we can collaborate. You know, what's working, what isn't. I am often doing work with like student governments. I think that's like a big part of my job is essentially using student governments as an outreach method or an outreach strategy because and you know we can get into this later, but like SGAs have so much power that has been like untapped in the food insecurity and SNAP and basic needs insecurity world. Um, so that's a large part of my job. In addition, I oversee work in the Great Lakes region related to like development of student working groups and crowdsourcing of policy advocacy from students. Um, what else? Conferences, conference proposals. I feel like I write a lot of conference proposals as well. Uh, yeah.
Nice. Yeah. They don't really tell you the challenges sometimes of being in a remote organization. It is a lot of computer work, a lot of, like you said, emails and remote tasks, but it does feel nice those times when y'all get to like meet in person. I know you said
Yeah.
the team will be involved more soon. So
Yeah.
uh yeah, but you mentioned that in your work you work a lot with student governments for outreach purposes, trying to mobilize them around basic needs advocacy. So, in your experience, what have you found to be some of the most effective ways for engaging student governments in basic needs work on their campuses?
Yeah, right. So SGA, student government associations, this is where like my philosophy brain comes into play, right? Like we ask ourselves like what's the thing that SGAs are uniquely capable of doing that no one else on campus can do? And the answer is that like SGAs are really the primary vehicle for student self-advocacy, specifically surrounding like sustainable, long-lasting changes on systemic levels. Um, and you know, in order to accomplish that, they yield like really pretty hefty budgets depending on the population of of a campus. Um, And so, like, SGAs have the power, if they wanted to set up a recurring fund for their campus's food pantry. And, they can fund that according to how the SGA thinks that is something worth doing. But, like, theoretically, they could put their max budget behind a food pantry if they really wanted to. Or they can establish an executive, like, student leadership position within the SGA around, like, a vice president of basic needs position, something like that that will year over year, regardless of SBNC or what we're doing, that position will advocate on behalf of, say, the basic needs interests of all students. And so that's like one of the main asks we're making of SGAs right now that we're working with is to create a vice president or a director or whatever role of basic needs in their SGA, include a line in that position that says like maintain a relationship with SBNC, distribute our NAVI eligibility screener. And that way we don't have to reinvent the wheel every single year. We can have sustained relationship with SGAs. And then like that's really where interesting work can get done, right? Is when you have those long-lasting relationships with an SGA and the policy environment of that campus is being framed through, basic needs among students. Um, yeah. Also, SGAs can send like an Avi link and email to every student, which is something that like most student groups can't do. That's like the highest return on investment action like we can take in terms of like Navi eligibility screener.
Yeah, it's always great to hear the work that certain student governments do on their campuses and the roles that these SGAs play in some of their basic needs work. I've personally talked to a few different representatives from some different colleges and universities now across the country where their student government, yeah, like you said, funds either
Mm-hmm.
their campus food pantry or pays for the student staff that manages the food pantry, whatever it may be. I think you're right. There is a lot of untapped power that SGAs can have when it comes to driving the lead with basic needs advocacy. On the flip side of that, what do you think are some common barriers or challenges that may currently prevent certain student government associations from taking on basic needs advocacy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really weird time to be doing this work on campuses. Um, to just put it simply, like especially around SGAs, there are complete like SGA agencies on certain campuses being completely cut for whatever reason, political reasons. Um, SGAs are like heavily deprioritizing this work. Um, there are misguided notions about how many students on campus are experiencing basic needs and security. And so all those things are barriers, right? Either they don't believe that this work is like the right thing to do, or they don't believe that this work is necessary. Um, those barriers can be overcome, one, by just like consistent, outreach and really willing to be a nuisance, to some SGA people and to have the data to back up what you're talking about, right? Like 10% of a campus's population theoretically is a number of students that qualify for SNAP but aren't receiving it, right? So, you can do that math on your campus, and that's like a huge data point because, like, if they're in that camp of like simple ignorance when it comes to basic needs and security, 10% of people could be receiving SNAP benefits. And for most SGAs, right, like realistically, what they care about at the end of the day is like going to be retention because they want to see their university doing better. And so being able to make that connection between increased basic need security and retention will help a lot, right? Like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you're hungry, you're not going to be able to focus on your schoolwork. And so that's potentially 10% of the population who could be having a higher retention rate if they were receiving SNAP benefits. And that's why it's important for SGAs to take on this work if they aren't already. I think that's the first thing I would say.
Yeah, that's so important because even though I feel like there's so much work being done around food security, advocacy, and basic needs work, I still feel like in many areas of the US, like in many colleges and universities, there is still yeah, like lack of understanding about how prevalent the issue really is, especially among college students. I personally give some like presentations and do some outreach on my own college campus where I work, and share with students some of those numbers and data points about what this need really looks like. And students are shocked sometimes because I don't think they always realize, the full scope of the issue, if it doesn't, necessarily pertain to them or they don't necessarily see that in their day-to-day lives. And I
Mhm.
think student governments are really important for filling that gap, given that they have, a really large reach to a lot of the student body and can communicate those messages out then to the rest of the student body.
100%.
Um, so for student leaders who might be listening to this and want to be someone on their campus that pushes for basic needs advocacy on their college campus, but doesn't know where to start, what are some first steps that you suggest that they can take to begin advocating for food security within their student government structures?
Yeah, so probably the best thing you can do right off the bat is identify the person in the SGA who's most likely to be responsible or responsive to basic needs conversation. And that might be the president of the SGA. That there might be a specific officer who handles basic needs and security, or more broadly like student satisfaction or student health or something like that. Just look into your SGA structure and see who's who, and send an email to all of them. No harm in that. um, I just tried talking to that person about the SNAP gap, right? Anyone can see as a problem that only one third of SNAP eligible students are actually enrolled in SNAP. And then, from there, tell them that there's this great organization, Student Basic Needs Coalition, that is doing this work and working hard to address it. Set a meeting with me. I'm happy to meet with any of y'all. Shoot me an email at august@studentbasicneeds.com, and I'll talk to y'all, and we'll come up with a campus specific strategy for you. But really, just like sitting down, having that conversation, and if that's something that they care about, that should be enough to like, spark that in them and get them moving on it. And if not, then we'll talk more specifically about how we can make something happen.
For sure. Well, awesome. One last question I have for you is kind of looking ahead. I like to kind of leave things on a positive note sometimes. So,
Hmm.
looking ahead, how do you see SBNC's partnerships with student government associations and statewide working groups evolving?
Yeah, so I don't know when this podcast episode is going to come out, but right now it's just been me and one part-time student employee doing this work. And within the next 3 months, we're going to like three times or four times or five times that level of effort. More hires doing this work. Um, it's gonna be great. So it's just like more people doing more regional specific work means that this will be happening wider and deeper. More intentional and meaningful relationships with SGAs and more SGAs that we're working with. So that's really exciting. And then like, because once we get that like baseline relationship started with an SGA, then like that's the foundation from which like all sorts of really cool stuff can happen. So right now we're still, kind of pavement, setting up that framework, and then we'll see once we get there. And statewide working groups, we're looking. Our big goal is to have one student working group in every state. Uh, I think off the top of my head, I can think of like 10 to 15 that exist right now. We just, I'm creating six in the Great Lakes region right now. So that's Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, Wisconsin. Um, that's been just like this past fall 2025 semester. So they're going to start cropping up, I believe. Um, yeah, there's a lot to come. We're just getting started.
Awesome. Yes, lots of great work to come. Love to hear it. Well, August, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your insights on how student governments can really lead the way in advancing basic needs advocacy on campus. Uh, I appreciate the incredible work that you're doing and others within the SBNC team as well. And I'm excited to see this work unfold as you continue in this role. So thanks again.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, that wraps up this week's episode of the Student Impact Report. So make sure to follow us on Instagram at SBNC_USA for updates. You can also catch our episodes, including this one, on Spotify and YouTube. See you next time.